Welcome. We're pleased to welcome you to the first exhibition of the season at the gallery at Cal IT2, and an exhibition that in many ways represents the kind of thing that the gallery is really aiming to do, the kinds of cross-disciplinary collaborations that we really are geared for. And in this case, a collaboration between the Visual Arts Department, we might say, and the Department of Cognitive Science, the Dolphin Cognition Lab, and brought together under the umbrella of Cal IT2 and the research environment here. So we're very pleased to be able to bring these parties together, and tremendous thanks are due to Cal IT2 and its Division Director Ramesh Rao for continuing to support this kind of work because it's, of course, sometimes rather unruly and doesn't quite often fit the kind of conventional categories that we like to have for things. And it brings together some energies that are not always the most compatible. In this case, bringing together the objective and the implicated, what can be explained and what should be experienced. Encounters that are not always easy to orchestrate and don't always have tangible results, and also sometimes introduce unexpected challenges, and whose benefits are often very, very subtle. And so we're really pleased to be able to present to you this project that in many ways really brings all of these commitments into play. And the staging ground, we have the Speculative Dolphin Theatre. And in terms of what it brings together, we could say the objectively analytical and the creatively synthetic. All kinds of ways we could talk about it, really. But the best way, of course, is to introduce the people responsible. And so I'm very, very pleased to introduce Lisa Korpos, a new media artist and second-year MFA candidate here at UCSD, who uses digital media, performance, and environmental intervention to explore the forms of sentience, the forms that sentience takes across the animal kingdom. Her aim is to generate objects and experiences that teeter at the intersections of worlds and perspectives, not quite belonging to us nor to the animals. Christine Johnson, a researcher and lecturer in the Department of Cognitive Science. Her Dolphin Cognition Lab, which was founded 20 years ago, does observational analyses of real-world interactions between socially sophisticated animals. Dolphins in this case, but not only dolphins. She's interested in the evolution of social cognition, takes a comparative approach to study, and applies a distributed cognition model to these interactions. And I'm very pleased to introduce our respondent for today, Lisa Cartwright, professor in the Department of Visual Arts with additional appointments in the Department of Communication and the Graduate Science Studies program. She works at the intersections of visual culture, critical theory, and feminist science and technology studies. And through the Catalyst Lab here on campus that she directs, produces the online journal Catalyst, Feminism, Theory, and Technoscience, as well as supports collaboration with FemTechNet, an international network of feminist scholars, artists, and teachers of technology, science, feminism, and digital studies. So we will get started with, we'll begin with a presentation of the artists, or the artist and scientist, collaborative team. And after that, we will have a short response from Professor Cartwright. And then we will have use those responses as a catalyst for conversation on the panel. And then we will open it up to conversation with you. So without further ado.
Thank you, Jordan. Good evening, everyone. So, what exactly is a speculative dolphin theater anyway? Multiple people have asked me that by this point as I've been working on this project for the past year. So, a speculative dolphin theater, this project, consists of underwater research video and hydrophone recordings sourced from the Brookfield Zoo in Chicago. Layered on top of these video projections are speculative spoken word interpretations of the dolphins' interactions with one another. 3 scripts play sequentially. Each one is synchronized to the same looping video segment to generate multiple potential narratives. But before delving too far into that, I would first like to give you a general overview of my practice and research. So the work that I do is at the intersection of the brain sciences, so research on animal perception and behavior, then critical animal studies, which is kind of a fledgling field that asks bigger theoretical questions about the human-animal relationship, such as how do people and societies construct the concept of the animal? How do we define personhood and humanity in opposition to that? And where do the boundaries between those categories start to become fuzzy? Usually this research manifests in experiential or visual forms for me, so immersive installations, media, performance, and sculpture, although I've done drawings for this series as well. Given the interdisciplinary nature of this research, I often find myself in spaces of science, spaces that artists don't typically have access to. One such space was Chris Johnson's animal cognition class, which I took during my undergraduate studies. In this class, Chris shared some of the knowledge and research that we've accumulated on bottlenose dolphins, which I found to be endlessly fascinating. So tonight, we wanted to share some of the most interesting tidbits about dolphin perception and communication with you guys. And here to do that is Chris Johnson.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everybody. I just want to say how thrilled I am to be here and what a pleasure and really a privilege it's been working with Lisa on this project. It's a dream come true for me as well as for her. So I'm thrilled to be here. So I've been asked to spread some facts about dolphins, or at least some of the few facts that we know and some of the ones that are particularly pertinent to Lisa's work. Bottlenose dolphins are fascinating to many of us, in part because we're impressed by how large their brains are. You can see that from this image that they actually have larger brains than we do, which can be intimidating. Certainly intriguing to think about what they might be doing with all that wetware. We also see prolonged immaturity in this species. That is, animals are not sexually mature until they're 10 or 12 years old. It doesn't really take 12 years to grow a big animal. You can get a sexually reproductive tiger in 2. So this indicates that maturity is delayed in these species, which is usually interpreted to mean that there's lots to learn for them to become proficient adults. So it takes a school. Fortunately enough, they live in a school, and all their learning, all their life takes place in a social community. You know, there's no nest, there's no burrow, there's no den, there's only each other. And so at different ages, there are different roles that the animals have to learn how to play, different rules, different role models, all of which they learn within the school, including how to surf. These are adult dolphins, and playfulness in adult mammals is a correlate of intelligence. Another correlate of intelligence is social complexity, and in bottlenose dolphins you can see, for instance, males forming coalitions with one another to compete with other such coalitions for access to the females. And excuse my use of blue and pink here. They also, in Shark Bay, for instance, in Australia, form what are called super alliances, where coalitions join together to form super coalitions to compete with other coalitions. And these can get quite complex. We have 3 or 4 or 5 coalitions banding together to fight off others for access to the females. Requires keeping track of a lot of things, who your friends are, who your allies are, who helped last time and who didn't, and so on. Lots to track cognitively. In hunting as well, they have to, of course, find the prey and capture them. They are all they're carnivorous hunters. They can hunt independently, or often they can collaborate, like this school is doing, where they're surrounding a fish school, pinning it to the surface, and then taking turns charging through it to get a mouthful of fish. They would not be able to get as good access if they were working this alone, so by working together, everybody benefits. When they do this, they use echolocation, which is their primary sensory modality, sending out a series of clicks out into the world that bounce off of objects in the world and send back echoes. These click trains are produced in the nasal passages. And think about it, I'm sure you know, dolphins have a blowhole on the top of their head, which leads to their nasal passages, and their sound-producing mechanism is in those nasal passages, called dorsal bursae, or sometimes rabbit ears, it's for obvious reasons. And these tissue vibrate, producing sounds that emanate through the acoustic lens called a melon in their forehead. So the sounds that the dolphins make are coming out of their foreheads. Now, so when you see them at SeaWorld opening their mouths going, wah, 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 they're not talking out of their mouths. Dolphins can't talk out of their mouths. They can only talk out of their foreheads, sometimes whistling out of their blowholes. The echolocation that they make is a train of clicks, like click, 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 like that. Each pulse is broadband. That is, it includes frequencies up to 150 kilohertz. And just to give you some notion of how high frequency that is, people only hear to 20 kilohertz. So dolphins can produce sound and hear it up to 150 kilohertz. So most of their auditory perception, most of their echolocation and listening occurs at supersonic levels compared to what we can hear. Echolocation, of course, allows them to discriminate the size, the distance, even the content of the targets that they insonify. That is, they get a different set of echoes from the flesh, another set of echo from the bones, another set of echo from the air sacs. It's sort of like X-ray vision, where they can actually sort of see what another animal is made of using echolocation. This echolocation beam is a narrow focus beam that comes out of their forehead and can be extremely intense. It can actually get up to levels of over 200 decibels, which is louder than a jet airline takeoff. It's a kind of sound that's so loud that you have to wear headphones to block the sound if you're going to be exposed to such sounds. They use these sounds not just to track fish, but on one another. So they can use echolocation, for instance, to inspect each other, basically sonogramming their pregnant females to see how the baby's doing, or in this case, the genitalia. And this brings up the notion of tactoacoustics. One of the things about these sounds that they make, because they're so intense, they actually have a tactile effect. If a dolphin buzzes you, you can feel the buzz. And they use this socially. This behavior is called beak genital propulsion, in which this animal not only is sort of physically stimulating with its rostrum the genital area of somebody else, but it's buzzing the whole time, sort of doing what we call a tickle buzz. They can also, however, do stuff that's not so friendly with these sounds. I've been in the water and I've been hit by 200 decibels, and it's really an unpleasant experience. Your bones rattle. And they use these very intense sounds in high arousal play and aggression on one another. Here we've got an image of several dolphins simultaneous going into the head of somebody who must have done something wrong and is taking this punishment. As far as hearing, the animals do not have external pinna. They don't have openings from their ears to the outside world. They hear with their jaw. Their jaw is filled with this fatty tissue that runs through their throat and their jaw all the way back to where their inner ear is shown in red here. Here's a view from below of the fat channels that carry the sound directly into the inner ears. And they have exquisite discrimination abilities. These animals can tell ball bearings apart that vary in a quarter of an inch in diameter at half a football field. So you can imagine trying to make that discrimination visually from that distance. Think about how close you'd have to be before you can tell two ball bearings are different in size by a quarter of an inch. That's the level of discrimination that echolocation provides for these guys. They also use it for vocal communication. In fact, there's multiple classes of sounds that they make for communication. In this image where you see time on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis, what we're looking at here, these little repeated vertical lines are the click, 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 click of echolocation. They also produce whistles, which are not broadband like the echolocation, but are just a single frequency at a time, oscillating in various ways. And they also produce what are called burst pulse calls. So I'll tell you just a little bit about each of these. The whistles are these narrow band contours that are primarily seem to be used for social context. So this whistle, for instance, is there's a wide variety from simple upsweeps to very complex multiple inflected sounds. And just to point out that it's not always necessary to leak air out of your blowhole when you whistle, but sometimes they do, and it may provide a little emphasis, a little visual cue to go along with an excited whistle. They also synchronize their calls. Spinner dolphins in Hawaii, for instance, come into the bays during the day to rest and socialize, and then move out into the deep water at night to feed. But if you might have 50 animals in the bay, they never leave anybody behind. And the way they accomplish this is that when it's time to get ready to go off to hunt, they start chorusing their whistles. Everybody starts whistling, and by the time all 50 animals are chorusing together with their whistle, everybody knows that everybody's on board, and they move together out of the bay. It's only when this chorus sort of reaches a crescendo with everybody participating that the animals finally leave the bay. One thing that we know about their whistles is that each individual produces what's called a signature whistle, where each individual has a specific contour that's associated with that animal. Operationally, they're defined as the whistle that you produce 80% of the time and everybody else produces the other 20% of the time. So, for example, animal A has its whistle, B, C, but notice that animal C also sometimes produces animal D's whistle. So it is occasionally used by others. So it's different from the way we use names. You're much more likely to use my name than I am, but in a dolphin, the animal, the signator, is much more likely to announce their own name. We were able to identify the signature whistles of all the animals at Brookfield, and you'll be hearing some of those in the film tonight. But the function of signature whistles is still poorly understood. It's often acts as some kind of a contact call, and makes sense to think of it as a way to sort of announce yourself when you're approaching other animals. When in dark or murky waters, I say, I'm Chris, here I come, here comes Chris. We also have a little bit of data that suggests that there's some call matching. So sometimes if I might be approaching a group and I'm saying, hi, I'm Chris, somebody in that group will call back Chris to me, sort of acknowledge that they recognize me. That happens between groups that tend to know each other rather than strange groups. But we're just beginning to scratch the surface and trying to understand the role that such call matching plays. We do see it in mother-infant reunions. In fact, one of the things that happens during pregnancy, near the end of the pregnancy, the mother starts giving her own signature over and over and over and over and over and over and over, hundreds of times per hour. Before the infant's born, the infant is presumably listening in the womb to this, and so when they're born, they already know their mother's whistle, and she can use that whistle to call the infant back to her. There are many things we don't know about them, and one of the most provocative ideas for me is what's going on with the non-signatories when they use one another's whistles. Are they summoning someone, or are they talking about them behind their back? We have yet to really get the data that we need to answer those questions. The real mystery, though, is the burst pulse sounds. The burst pulse... Oh, we're not animating. Okay, the burst pulse sounds are the least well understood. Basically, this is the catch-all category. If you don't know what the hell this sound is, you throw it in the burst pulse sound basket. We know a few things about them. Some are very high amplitude and correlate with high arousal. So some of them sound like screams and yelps and yahoos, and they happen when the animals are fighting or playing, and they probably are screams and yelps and yahoos. But there are other sounds that they make that people throw in that same category that are a lot more subtle and complex and may not just be a scream or a yelp. Some of them bear kind of a loose resemblance to echoes, which has provoked some people to think that maybe they're able to mimic the echoes that they produce. So for instance, if a dolphin goes out into the world and echolocates on a shark and gets an echo back of the shark, the question exists as to whether that animal then can mimic that echo to send that information about a shark to someone else. Total speculation, no data. But one of those questions I'd really like to know the answer to. We do know a few things. Even with the burst pulse calls, we know that they can and do synchronize them. And one of the things that we've learned about this is that it requires practice. If you look at a case like this with the spotted dolphins, where they're ganging up on somebody like this, and it's juveniles, you can see their calls are kind of all over the place. But by the time they reach adults, you can have 7 or 8 adults simultaneously all going, wah, 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 wah. So this group here, drilling into the head of this passive animal here, you see this beautiful synchrony that develops in the long-term coalitions that have learned how to work together and produce sounds together. Behavioral synchrony is also something that you see in dolphins. It begins day one and pretty much lasts their whole life. Continues to be important as a social signal. You see synchronous surfacings correlated with a pair continuing to stay together. Male coalitions, I talked about before, often involve these elaborate synchronous displays. And in the lab, we've been able to train motor mimicry, even to the point where we can get the dolphins to map their bodies to our own. So this is not a case of training a dolphin, when I lift my foot in the air, you should lift your tail in the air. What you've done is train the dolphin to do whatever it is I do, and then when you do something, they do their best to map it to their own bodies. They also show spontaneous mimicry. One of my favorite examples comes from Taylor and Samer in 1973, where a zoo guest blew some smoke at a dolphin at a baby at the window, watched by a baby bottlenose who zoomed off to its mother and got a mouthful of milk and came back and blew it back. So clearly the creativity is that big brain is at least capable of this sort of creativity, and this has been looked at a little bit systematically. For instance, you can train a dolphin to respond to a cue that means do something you've never done before. And once they sort of catch on to this, they'll stay up nights inventing new ways to jump and wiggle and do things so that when the trainer the next day asks them for a novel behavior, they can produce something, the side twist with the wiggle kick. And what's perhaps the most remarkable, but actually it makes perfect sense once you think about the role that synchrony plays in these animals' lives, they can also do this in tandem. That is, you can send two animals out and say, do something you've never done before, and they will do a totally novel behavior in perfect synchrony. So I think that Lisa has taken advantage and used these facts to her advantage and ours. And she's going to tell you more about that now.
That was some amazing stuff, right? I've heard a lot of these anecdotes, probably 3, 4, or 5 times now, and they never stop amazing me. So long after the animal cognition class that I was enrolled in was over, all of these amazing, spontaneous, creative capacities stuck with me. And when Christine first introduced me to the video research footage that she and her lab were using to analyze behavior, I was utterly spellbound by these simultaneous surveillance camera views. To me, it was this mysterious turquoise choreography occurring underwater. And it was also kind of a filmmaker's treasure trove. There were hours upon hours of surveillance footage ready for appropriation. So that's what I ended up using. I selected just 8 recorded minutes of the dolphins' lives, and I started constructing narrative scripts and imaginary sonicscapes based on what we know about them. The video itself initially appears to be chronological until the viewer realizes that they're experiencing actually the same snippet playing on loop. And it's overlaid with a new auditory world and narrative script each time. Every consecutive looping iteration casts more and more doubt on what constitutes reality within these pools. So the first script begins in a very familiar world. Viewers are behind the glass, in the air, situated firmly within a human frame of reference. There are the noises of the zoo, children squealing and speaking about dolphins. There's a kid that says, "Can they see us through the glass too?" There's an imaginary infotainment show that might play at an exhibit. A researcher observes the behavior of the dolphins in a really methodical way. In the second script, we leave the human world altogether and enter an aquatic auditory space that's just rooted in sensory inundation. It's rhythmic, it's full of bubbling and gurgling and splashing. There's the resonant sounds of echolocation, lots of chirps and pops. We also begin to hear the dolphins' voices, or human actors playing the dolphins' voices. So they use their signature whistles in different ways, and pretty much the ways that Christine described, where sometimes it's announcing their presence in a really provocative way. Sometimes they refer to one another or mock one another. They play tag. They have love triangles. They get jealous. And they speculate about us, too. So this loop is all about an imagined dolphin phenomenology. I was trying to convey what it's like to be a critter whose primary sensory mode of processing the world is acoustic and is tactile. So it's all about the 6-channel audio installation and being aware of the auditory space and what it's like to live in a world that's primarily composed of sonar and sound. Finally, in the third loop of the footage, the soundscape becomes something else altogether, with dolphins pondering about existence out loud. A lot of this has to do with their social nature, with synchrony, with mimesis. They duet a lot, mirroring one another's contemplations. One line goes, "Our bodies shift, submerge, and settle into a rhythm. Our eyes glide in their sockets, buoyed up by the sunbeams that cut through the lapping waves. We circle, all is metered, all repeats. We loop and loop and loop and loop," except it sounds a lot prettier than that because it was recorded by a music PhD who can sing. So the main overarching organization of the film was guided by this idea of layering common tropes of animal representation. For instance, the nature documentary, or a kind of Disneyfication in which we anthropomorphize the animals and place them into a kind of drama. But I wanted to also subvert the validity of any one of these specific representations by juxtaposing them together and calling into question what the reality is. So the narrative is constantly derailed, deconstructed, re-elaborated. And finally, there are the portraits. The stars of the show each had their portraits drawn. It was classical Renaissance style portraiture. Life-size, each of the dolphins is positioned in either a straight-on or three-quarter view, like a bust-like pose, sort of reminiscent of neoclassical tropes. And I wanted them to look as much as possible as though I were drawing people. The conceptual basis for this is that because dolphin social lives are so very much rooted and based in mimesis and mimicry, because they use that to communicate with one another, I began to think of mimetic, perfectly copied representational portraiture as an expression of care or closeness that's kind of an analog to how they express care or closeness. I've tried to the best of my ability, to perfectly copy their likeness, their unique facial features, because the act of copying in and of itself is something that they appreciate. The act of copying is intrinsically cetacean, and this project in general is so much about trying to get into the mind frame and cross the gap, the divide that separates us from animals. And so this was my attempt at it. That covers it. Thank you.
Let's see if this is working. So I think I'll speak from here because that gives me the opportunity to kind of move smoothly into the conversation that my comments are meant to engender. So I wanted to start by saying that I came to the work for the first time this evening myself. I didn't see it previously, and so my comments and questions are fairly spontaneous, so forgive me if I haven't kind of thought things through as deeply as I might have if I had more time to go and compose my comments. I want to begin by saying that I really loved Christine Johnson's account of mimicry and working with the dolphins to do things in tandem, because I couldn't help but think, wow, that's exactly what Christine and Lisa did, which was to work in tandem and to learn each other's techniques and methods. And here I want to emphasize that, sometimes when we think about science and art and the kind of work that artists have been doing, I guess you would say it could go back centuries, but really since the 60s, around working in labs, for example, working in the field, working in scientific contexts to do artwork. A lot of the times we think about this work as being, if not communication-based, art education about science, making science more kind of fun or interesting or aesthetically enriched. This isn't the kind of work that Lisa's doing. And I want to emphasize that UCSD visual arts has a very long tradition back to the beginning of the department of doing research-based art practice and developing in our MFA students and our undergraduates skills for doing research-based work. We see this currently in Jordan Crandall's own practice, in Benjamin Bratton's work, in Anya Galacho's work, and in the work done in the ICAM program, and more recently in the speculative design program. So I want to emphasize that research-based art practice concerns not just interpreting the work of science through artistic paradigms, but having the artist conduct research and learning experiences within science and bringing to that context the research-based approaches that are kind of indigenous to art practice, and making those two fields kind of collide and staying with the trouble of the differences across those kinds of practice. So this is a very unique kind of work that is one of the showcase practices that comes out of this kind of department. So it's therefore fitting that Lisa sought collaboration, as she had done as an undergraduate, in cognitive science, not as an observer or an interpreter, but as someone who was immersed in cognitive science practice. And furthermore, that she sought collaboration with somebody like Christine Johnson, whose work it is to study interaction and to study those kinds of meetings of two. So Christine Johnson's work is about animal-to-animal communication. She studies dolphins, she studies people, she studies, is it bonobos that you study? So for 20 years, Christine Johnson's work has been looking at the way communication occurs, not to say, this is what they're saying together, but this is where things get missed. This is where differences happen. This is how language changes. And so we might similarly say that the kind of work that Lisa and Christine are doing together is telling us this is where things get missed. This is where the intersection changes the way science gets done, the way art gets done. So we move along the respective languages of these two fields in this intersectional space, which is never smooth and never easy, but always interesting. And so Lisa's really learning on two levels at once, not to be perfect in both, but to forge this kind of third intersectional area. So I want to throw out a few questions, kind of as an opening for discussion. So first of all, I underscore the rareness of artist-scientist collaboration, which really respects the research-based aspects of both practices, in which the artist is herself immersed in research as more than a communicator of ideas. So I want to ask, I think it's very clear what doing this brings to art practice and to the visual arts and audiovisual arts. What does it bring to science? And the only way we can approach that is by posing the question to Christine, what does this bring to cognitive science to have an artist do the kind of work that Lisa is doing collaboratively with her? I'm just going to put a few questions out, and that way we can begin to pursue them. Second, what are the implications of working with materials that are not only live? You're probably aware of work with tissue culture, work with plants in the arts, work with sentient materials, but what does it mean to work with what Christine describes as socially sophisticated creatures, mammals, such as dolphins? Is it different? Does Lisa need to conduct herself almost like she would need to conduct herself if she was working with live human subjects? And finally, what is the responsibility of the artist to know her science and to know it well? And what is the responsibility of the scientist to know her art and know it well in these sorts of collaborations? So those are three questions, and I would leave it to Christine and Lisa to decide which we should pursue first, if you want to pursue them at all.
Are you interested in tackling the first one?
No. It's tough. I guess that I'm trying to think of what I've gained as a scientist from this process. And one of the real sort of surprises and, I guess, insights for me watching Lisa work and seeing her interact with her community and such is I think I came into this thinking that truth is kind of my business. I mean, my job is to try to work at revealing and finding truth, and that there are these very specified practices that you have to use to do this, and very clear rules about what you can and cannot do, and that there's a detachment that you're supposed to have towards, your work, such that, I mean, one of the basic assumptions of science is replicability, right? So we believe this is true if not only I do the manipulations that produce these results, but anybody could come in and do those same manipulations, follow the same methodology, and produce the same results. And it's that assumption that lets us say, okay, we're really getting at something real here. What I've discovered in this process is that there's another way to get at truth that is not impersonal or objective, but is extremely personal. It's a private truth, a private expression of truth that, if that's honest and real, I think ends up producing something that's just as widely applicable as the demands of the truth of my science. So that was unexpected for me.
Interesting. Really interesting.
That was really beautifully said,
Yeah.
and I don't even know how to respond. I kind of want to move on and tackle the question of ethics, and thinking about the ethics of doing any kind of work, whether it's art practice or more scientific research with animals that do have these incredible capacities. And so the answer for me is a very clear-cut yes. Like, we need to be extraordinarily careful about how we proceed. And throughout the process of developing this installation, the ethics of it were brought up repeatedly. And I think that territory like this is just inherently contentious, no matter what. So
I want to follow up a little bit on that and pick up on the second question you had asked, Lisa, around sociality and socially sophisticated materials a bit. But sort of one thing I think about, and I wonder for both of you a bit, there's the tendency to want to speculate about the content of communication, and a lot of what you presented is about the means, the structure, but you stay back when you go too far into thinking about what is being communicated. You stay on the side of the how a little bit more, of necessity. And there's always this danger, of course, of anthropocentric, of overprojection, overly humanizing by speculating about what is actually. But what's really interesting is that in fact is that I come away with, and a lot is sometimes that we always overemphasize the what, and here it's the choreographic, the kinds of means is so pronounced and so sensual that it almost like kind of eclipses the focus on the kind of the what is being said a bit, But there is in videos language, spoken language used, and so there is some. You did, and you had a little bit more ability to do that as an artist. So maybe it's a question a little bit for both of you about this question of content, Christine, and also for you a little bit about how did you dive into that moment, and what were the perils to that, and also a little bit about the kind of the necessity of omitting of holding back from suggesting too much in your research?
I spend a lot of time counseling my students and the interns that work in my lab to be very careful to not jump into the attributions that they want to make. I mean, we on the one hand, we sit around and tell stories about what the animals are doing, and inevitably there's anthropomorphic interpretations going on. She's jealous, he's mad, she's upset. She wants him, but he doesn't really want her. He really wants her little sister, but So we do that, but we also, I felt that I spent a lot of time also sort of saying, but we know this is not what we're here doing as scientists. When we have our science hats on, then it's a very different story. Then I've seen in my field in animal cognition all kinds of problems that have come up because of models of the cognitive processes that whatever animals are going through being based on presumptions about mental representations or whatever that are based on self-reflection in humans, and I think there's really good reason to think that whatever the hell's going on in the dolphin's mind is really nothing like, or very little like what's going on in humans. I could go on and on about why I think that, but I do, this experience has been kind of liberating for me because I've spent so many years saying, you can't really go that far, you can't quite say that, you can't assume that, you can't, pull it back, that's my job, always to pull them back. Whereas here I've been able to just go, hey, have at it.
Jump in.
Go for it. And with somebody talented like Lisa, that's, it's been a real joy to watch, to sort of get some vicarious pleasure out of watching her just go for it.
So I've had many conversations in Chris Johnson's lab where she always does this walking back from the narratives where methodologically they're not valid for science, but narratives are really valid for art. And so for me, it was really satisfying to be able to take something that could not fly in the cognitive sciences, but was clearly still pertinent in some way, and to really take this sort of imaginative projection that Christine was doing and to go wild with it, really. So...
Great. I think it might be a good moment to ask to invite you to respond and ask questions. So over here. Do we have a roving mic, or do we have? Oh, we do. Oh, come on up to the. Yeah. Just,
Hello. This one works.
okay, maybe go over.
This one works.
Hello? Oh. All right. So the topic of sentience has been brought up a lot, and I'm really curious if the scientific methodology, by omitting sort of the anecdotal and the anthropomorphization, actually prevents there from being an attainable standard for what constitutes something sentient and deserving of rights, and or deserving of sort of acknowledgement of sort of a greater sort of at least credit for the entire process, and does incorporating arts into this as a method of introducing anecdotal experience and humanization actually unlock some of what science potentially leaves out intentionally. Should I sit down? I can sit down.
Go ahead.
So I think the question that you're asking is actually more of a philosophical one than a scientific question. I think in cognitive science, I've read something like 10 or 20 different definitions for consciousness. And it seems as though there are always moving goalposts for what defines sentience and what keeps us really separate from other forms of sentience. So the ability to feel pain or to suffer was for a long time one of those goalposts, and then it was communication systems and language, and it seems like evidence is introduced all the time that make the boundary between people and other critters a little bit more fuzzy and nebulous. It's perhaps a little idealistic or optimistic. I would like to think that work like this does indeed sort of point towards that direction of this notion of consciousness or sentience being more widespread throughout the whole animal kingdom, and something that we should take seriously, not just within our own species.
Congratulations. Is this?
Oh, you have to use that one over there.
I think it seems like it's working. I think we're good. So I'll project as well. So first of all, congratulations, Lisa. This is awesome, and dolphins are amazing. More amazing than I ever expected. So I'm really curious about something that you wrote in the write-up here that says that you're looking to destabilize the viewer's anthropocentric frame of reference. Mm-hmm. And so I haven't seen the videos yet. I'm really excited to, but I'm really curious if you've done any work to understand how your audience is sort of consuming or reacting or understanding the work, if they see it as like quote-unquote real science or play or fiction or fake or something along those lines. So, thanks.
Thank you, Gabi. Unfortunately, the installation has been up for all of like 2 seconds, so I can't really comment on audience reactions much. I will keep you updated as that changes, though.
I think, though, you'll see that what looks like science gets left behind pretty quickly in the video, which I think is exactly what should happen. I mean, it sort of starts there, but then it moves off into territory that should make it pretty clear that this is a different view.
We have another. I think we had someone else up there. Oh, you go ahead. Sorry.
I guess you get one or the other. That's it.
Question for Professor Johnson. I think that's her name, right?
Yes.
Okay. Actually, I have two. They're both technical, kind of. So you showed those plots, and I'm curious, what was on the vertical axis? Is it like a Fourier?
You're talking about the sonograms, the sound?
Yes,
It's frequency over time.
And it's like an intensity, right?
The intensity is the intensity of the color, yes.
Yeah.
So dark. In some of the images, I think it's like, the redder the color, the louder.
Okay. Okay, that's one of my questions. And the horizontal axis is time. In seconds?
A typical signature whistle is about a second long.
Okay. All right. My other question has to do with you compared the two brains, like a human brain and the dolphin's brain, and you showed like it's larger for the dolphin. Is it mostly because there's a lot of like motor skills they have to have, and how does the cortical part, the thinking part, compare? Is it similar in density, neural density, or?
It's complicated.
It's complicated.
I teach a whole class about this, so maybe you should come to some of those sessions. But their brains are unusual by mammalian standards in some ways. I mean, I think brain stem is pretty conservative, but the cortex is very different. Only 5 layers of cells instead of 6. No layer 4, which if you know anything about mammalian cortices, you'll know that's very bizarre because layer 4 is the layer the input layer, and dolphins don't even have a layer 4, so clearly stuff is getting input into their cortex, but not through the usual mammalian routes. So a lot of things about their brains that are peculiar. Very small, a huge brain, but little corpus callosum, so very little connection between the 2 hemispheres. They can sleep with one hemisphere at a time and be awake with the other hemisphere. So it's just, especially for somebody like me who knows these details, it's very difficult to just flat out compare and say, oh, I mean, I was being a little glib by showing big brain pictures and go, oh, look, their brain's bigger than ours, therefore, ... And I'll leave it to you to fill in about, oh, well, then they must be as smarter. There's no straight up correlation, that I can say, oh, then because they have X cubic centimeters of brain, therefore they are as smart as a chimpanzee, but not as smart as a human, or so. I can't. Those things don't make sense within what we know to be able to come up with simple answers like that. All that being, and plus they're big-bodied animals, and so brains scale up when bodies scale up. But all that being said, they do have a heck of a lot of cerebral cortex. And we don't know a whole lot about what's doing what. Very few studies, very difficult to study for obvious reasons, right? Aquatic animals, not easy to get them into an fMRI or something. So, although some of that has been done, and there's actually people in the audience who have done a little of that work, making me nervous. So, but I think that there are good behavioral indices that there's some pretty complex cognition going on. There's a fair amount of work from the lab that I didn't talk about at all. Different kinds of problem-solving skills and such that suggest that they're doing some pretty sophisticated stuff. I don't like the whole idea of trying to put them on a scale, or any of the animals on a scale of, from dumb to smart or something. It doesn't work. I think one of the messages in Lisa's work that I really resonate with is that every species is their own cognitive creature. Each species creates a reality that's specific to that animal based on the kind of sensory access that they have, the kind of motor abilities that they have, the morphology of their body. I mean, us being primates with our busy little hands and our hand-eye coordination, it's going to lead to a very different brain and a very different mind than the dolphins, who can't manipulate things with their hands and have echolocation that can see through the boundaries of other creatures and stuff. So that just the raw content is so different that whatever cognition is going on has got to be different. What I usually argue in my classes is that they're very alien, very different. Their minds work very differently than us. The one place we converge, though, is in social cognition. That it looks like some of the higher primates and the cetaceans have, not because they have a common ancestor, but through facing similar cognitive challenges, social challenges in particular, like coalition formation and the various demands that puts on you, requires a certain level of cognitive complexity to adapt. So it just so happens that dolphins and primates and elephants have sort of converged on some similar solutions to some similar problems, even though they're bringing very different repertoires to bear on those problems. So, complex. Yeah.
Testing. Hello? All right. All right. Testing. Hello. This question is mostly for you, Dr. Johnson. I know this is Speculative Dolphin Theatre, so there's artistic license being taken. But I haven't seen the exhibition yet, but I do know that there's some kind of translations of dolphin speech to human speech. And it was mentioned in the pamphlet that I received that some of that is actually scientifically accurate based upon research that has been done. So my question is, could you elaborate on that research, both here at the Dolphin Cognition Lab or around the world? You just mentioned fMRI and other, what are the typical processes and methods that the research uses today? Thank you.
Big questions to answer in 3 minutes. I actually don't think, we don't know hardly anything about dolphin communication, embarrassingly little. Not surprising because we don't, they're very difficult to study, they're aquatic, they had this weird system that we don't even, don't have an equivalent of in our species. I would say that I think it's extremely unlikely that dolphins are doing what I'm doing right now in terms of stringing together arbitrary sounds and syntactically organized sequences. I would lay money that they're not doing that. I don't really know what they're doing, but the little hints that I've seen, talking about speculating, I think that their system may be more mimetic, that it's more about not what you say, but how similar it is to what the other guy just said. So it's more about the synchrony, more about the similarity of the sounds than their content. Although I really have to say, we just don't know. We know so little. We know a fair amount about echolocation because the Navy's interested in sonar, and the dolphin still has better sonar than the Navy does, so they're researching that. We know a little bit about the signature whistle things, announcing yourself. But in our study, we scored 18,000 whistles, and only 6,000 of those were signatures. So I have nothing to say about the other 12,000 whistles, not to mention all the burst pulse sounds that everybody just pushes aside because nobody knows how to deal with them. So the bottom line is the work hasn't been done yet. Even what we're trying to do at Brookfield has been very frustrating. We have 3 hydrophones. We can tell which sounds are coming from which tank, but we still can't even tell which animal is producing which sound. I think the next step is going to have to be to plant a hydrophone on the head of every animal in the tank so that we can know. How can you study communication when you don't know which animal is producing the sound? It's absurd. There are serious impediments to my being able to give a decent answer to that question.
Oh, I'd like to expand upon that just a little bit in terms of what was actually scientifically credible in the scripts. The short answer is very little. I did give the dolphins specific stage names that correspond in time to their actual signature whistles, which you can hear. So there's the naming aspect of it that is in some ways perhaps a little scientifically credible on some level. And then the mimetic quality of the communication, where a lot of them are duetting and sort of sending out the same message at almost the same time. So it's more about the synchrony and the mimicry than it is the actual content of the message. Big disclaimer, the content is in no way reflective of what they're actually talking about because we have no way of knowing.
Deborah?
Thanks. It's great to see the work on dolphins come together and this kind of collaboration. I wanted to bring back to the question of narrative because you kind of said that narrative belongs to art and not to science, and I would say that's not true. Narrative belongs to humans and whatever they do, including science. And it might be a way to actually get closer. So some of you know that I've done similar kind of work with Rachel Mieri on primates. And one of the things that I've learned, partly from her, partly from the kind of work that Bruno Latour does, when he says, if you follow actors and they're doing something that's strange, you don't go up to a theory to try and explain it. You get closer to the life of these actors. So in a way, I would suggest get more into the narrative. talked a lot about it, but to get to the point where you can actually follow the narrative of your creature the same way that you would follow the narrative of yourself. So almost to be even more of a phenomenologist. And what's nice about the science today is that we are getting closer to having sensors that you will be able to put on a dolphin's head. So we're getting to the point where we can extend our sensory network to do like a much better ethnography and build their life bottom up like we do our own. So how do they get through the day? How do they interact? When does the first infant do that? The lucky thing about dolphins is that they're social mammals. And when you look across social mammals, and maybe a lot of also social species, you start to see similar things. And you talked about the convergence, the kind of ecological convergence. So I think there is hope to actually use this kind of your artistic desire to be in the phenomenon, in the narrative, to actually make the science better. And in fact, I haven't seen your video yet, but from what you described, these 1, 2, and 3 loops, I think scientists have forgotten to talk about null hypothesis, alternative hypotheses, and to actually create these alternative worlds is very important for the science. And I think that would be a way.
Thanks, Deborah.
Amy?
I've actually got a question for each of you. So, Professor Johnson, your very last slide, you had novel tandem behavior. In other words, the dolphins were asked for some novel behavior, and you're saying in tandem they both did something novel. Does this imply that they've got some sort of communication ESP? How did they know this?
I don't know really the answer to that question. They've looked to see or listened to see if they're communicating like, okay, we're gonna do the jump, but it doesn't seem like there's reliably vocalization going on necessarily during the sort of prep before they come out and do whatever it is they're gonna do. My guess is it's really just that they've spent their whole lives, they're masters of the immediate read off of your partner that it takes to be synchronous. And I think that they've been doing that literally since day one, when the infant for the first several months just is beside its mother and makes every move the same that she makes. And I think they're just really adept at matching. So whether there's somebody who's like taking the lead and the other one is just doing really well at matching it, or if somehow it's more spontaneous and they're both reading off each other. But
are dolphins big on nonverbal communication? Are they kind of like making eye contact and nodding?
Well, it certainly is a part of what they certainly communicate non-verbally.
It's like all nonverbal, right?
Pardon me?
It's pretty much all nonverbal, no?
Well, no, they're very vocal, so they do a lot of vocal.
I guess it
yeah,
depends
not
on
verbal, but a lot of vocal.
Okay.
I just think that it seems magical to us that they could just pull this off. How could you ever do that? But I think if you're just tuned in and out, the idea of doing something in tandem is something that's very easy to train a dolphin to do. They kind of naturally fall into that. And I think that if they both know how to do the creative thing, then doing it tandemly is just sort of second nature.
Can I follow up on your question, because I hear this distinction between vocal and verbal, but I also hear Jordan's point, which is that to what extent is the vocal really about the tactile and bouncing sound? So is the vocal really a tactile thing?
Well, the echolocation can be tactile, so they can put out, when they do the clicks or these loud pops that they make, whatever they're very intense, you can feel those. But the whistles are not necessarily tactile.
So they're not saying like, this is where I am in relationship to you. which would maybe be a spatialized
Well,
tactile
I think all
dish.
local communication does that, accomplishes
Okay.
that, sort of localizes you
Huh.
as the source of the sound. And certainly the signature whistles do seem to have that role of sort of saying, not only is there somebody here, but that somebody is me, you know. But I think there are probably lots of different kinds of vocal communication is what it comes down to. And we're just scratching the surface, figuring it out.
Yeah, I think of that. I thought of what you described as verbal. It's kind of interesting. Maybe it's not. My question for Lisa about a piece that I've not yet seen, but this frame that you have in front of us is very curious because I know you're talking about the problems of anthropomorphizing, but also drawing things in this way that we relate to them as humans. And obviously, this shot, is in portrait language and cinema language, right? This is like this close up, and so we now sort of are seeing into the mind of this character who is the dolphin. And it makes me think, gosh, dolphin cinematography, and the cinematic language of dolphin narrative must be a very strange thing to work with. Did you have as you were working with this, were you having sort of all of these moments of superimposing cinematic language on it and then thinking about whether you really wanted to do that?
I mean, yes, it was definitely a difficult balance to try to strike, and something that's sort of conceptually kind of difficult to negotiate a little bit. In terms of the portraits, my intention was very much to anthropomorphize them, which is obviously very, very clear.
She did a really great job of catching their personalities too. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Amy, what was the other part of your question? The cinematic tropes and reconciling.
Sort of language of montage and, this is a close-up and so we interpret it this way, but then you're looking at it and going, well, it's only happening because the dolphin is in portrait mode and when the dolphin is swimming it doesn't work that way.
Right.
It
So
seems like it would be really interesting thing to find yourself working on.
right. I actually managed to avoid that territory altogether because in terms of the cutting and editing logic, I really wanted it to be more of a straightforward documentary style sequence where you're seeing the behavior as it actually occurred. Where basically the only logic behind the editing decision was, can I see the dolphins clearly in this tank right now, and is the behavior really continuous? So the cinematic language of things like montage and close-ups were not really part of the project.
Okay, I think we should end. We actually invite everyone now to actually see the exhibition. It will be open for a while, so please join us outside for reception and join us in the gallery. And please let's give a round of thanks for our panelists today. Really appreciate you guys.